are alive and well in many ways, and that's not going away.
This is the North American Service broadcasting on 17.70, 15.42, 12.05.
How you will worship her together.
What have you done to its eyes?
The next time you're frightened in the dark, don't scream.
They are not what they claim to be. You're listening to Radio
It's November. It's November. It's November. It's November.
Gravy?
Turkey? Pilgrims? Oatmeal? No.
Oatmeal.
Yeah, like the Puritan or whatever they're called. Is that what they're called?
Quakers.
Yeah, Quaker oatmeal. Puritan. Isn't that what they call themselves?
I think they're different, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think they're two different things.
Yeah.
There's like Quakers, Puritans, Mormons, like all that shit.
God, they all fucking suck.
They're all scared of potato batteries, potato lights.
What? What is potato lights? Doesn't matter.
Did you never see the episode of Dexter?
No.
Dexter's Lab.
No.
He like goes to live in the country and he makes
A potato light?
a light out of a potato,
And they're
which is
like-
something you can do.
Yeah.
And they get all super mad because
Wow.
they don't have electricity.
I love that.
And they don't like devil shit like electricity.
I like Super Monkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dial M for monkey.
Dial M for monkey.
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 We need you.
Anyways, welcome to Radio Grave.
I'm here with Amber.
I'm here with Dom. We are awake. We are happy.
Awake and unafraid. You didn't let me make the joke because you kept going.
Okay, you want to try again?
Asleep or dead? No, it's too late.
My cam. Okay, well, all you churts out there who are celebrating Thanksgiving, listen up.
That's churtly behavior.
You know what? That's churtly behavior. And also, like, we don't really celebrate Thanksgiving. I don't care what you do, but it is the 4th week of Indigenous Heritage Month,
Yeah.
which means that it is part 4 of The Legend of Sasquatch.
The last part.
The last part, 4 weeks of straight squatch and straight, like, other stuff too.
Giants.
Giants,
Ogresses.
hairy man and his tears,
Skinny dippers.
Jesus saves,
Holes.
holes, serious holage.
Dogs going in holes. Dogs going on roofs.
Dark watchers.
Dark watchers.
Dark watcher.
Watching in the dark.
Watching in the dark.
Watching darkly in the dark.
I keep thinking about like the gremlin from Twilight Zone pushing his face up against the window, just like the guy who was in the truck who had the Sasquatch doing that just to scare him. The 10-footed horse. That was a scary story. I did not like that. Cruel.
Yeah, you're always... You mention a lot about the cans on his feet. And I'm just kind of like, yeah. And you're like, no, that's fucked up.
I don't know why.
Up.
It just
And I'm
is like bizarre. And I think it's like, because I imagine if you had like cans on your hands and like the edges are sharp, you know, they're empty cans.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah. Metal cans on your feet. I feel like that'd be painful. But we don't know how big those cans were. They could have been like coffee cans.
It's kind of what I was thinking because they were given
Bigger.
Yeah.
Like government cans. Yeah.
Because the little one wouldn't... A horse couldn't even get their foot in it.
No. Well, you know, we left off last episode talking about, we were telling a couple stories that were documented by J.W. Burns by the Stehelis people. We left off on one particular story, which was the Charlie Victor story about coming into contact with the one female Sasquatch, what can be assumed as a Sasquatch, but he believed was not. And she was racist as fuck and mean. Yeah. And what did he say? Demoniacal?
Yeah, she was demoniacal.
Yeah. But we continue on our series with the Stehelis people and with J.W. Burns' involvement. But this might get a little bit dark. So I just want to put out a quick trigger warning for this episode because we do kind of talk about implied sexual assault. And also we do talk about violence against women. So
Violence against Native women.
yeah, specifically.
Yeah.
and some other like sensitive topics. Obviously, I want to talk about Sasquatch, but through my research over the course of years, more and more stories surfaced, and with it came a lot of complexities with the topic too. And like when speaking about violence against women in any situation, it's a difficult conversation to have. And then when you throw like something like Sasquatch in the mix of it, it's a topic that is like incredibly weird to discuss. So I think it's something worth addressing. So obviously we need to just put that out there. We aren't really here to sugarcoat that. All right. Well, we continue on with a testimony that was recorded by J.W. Burns, and it was specifically from a teenage Stehelis girl named Emma Paul. Burns described her as a keen-witted girl, and he was assured her story was totally truthful and deemed her as the last person he'd suspect to lie about an encounter. Her testimony goes as such, quote, "I saw the Sasquatch a few yards from the house. I was standing by the door at the time. He was watching me closely, dark watcher, and I had a good look at his face. He was very big and powerful in appearance. Other members of my family were present and they saw him too. We went inside and bolted the door, but he prowled around the house for some time. Since then, we have often heard them. One of them used to rub his fingers over the window panes. And only a few nights ago, a Sasquatch tramped loudly around the house and all of us heard him. And so did the white carpenter who lives next door." J.W. Burns and others believe that this visit from Sasquatch was one with total intention, and Emma Paul was who he was there to visit. A pretty steady theme that we only have mentioned but not really discussed is the abduction habits of Sasquatch. It's basically common knowledge. The hairy wild men of the mountains kidnap babies, children, and women. It is a behavior that has been observed since the beginning of their existence, and these tragedies have been documented throughout centuries of oral tradition and cautionary tales. So, specifically, when I started this series over a year ago, my focus was on one particular story, the harrowing tale of Seraphine Long of the Stehelis tribe. And simply enough, I wanted to tell her story and discuss the history of her tribe and obviously talk about Sasquatch, right?
Even before that, just as a note, before we actually had Radio Grave, it was like 5 years previous.
Oh, so long ago.
We wrote a really loose episode about Seraphine Long's story.
Well, I want to actually correct that. You wrote it. I wrote about a minor.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But that was long, long ago, and it didn't touch on really anything that we're going to discuss today. It was very like, this is what happened. Huh.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And then, but this is definitely more analytical.
Aware, I would say.
Yeah, more aware. But just a note of, we've been thinking about this for years.
Yeah, this
like
is a story
half a decade.
Yeah. And I feel like this is the first story that really like kind of opened up a door in my mind of Sasquatch as more than just Sasquatch or Bigfoot too.
If you enjoy our podcast, please rate, review, and consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/radiograve. Your patronage and support helps us continue to make content for you. You can stay up to date with us by following our Instagram account at Radio Grave Podcast, and be sure to tell all your spooky friends about us too. Thanks for listening. Now back to the show. So let's revisit Dr. Ed Fuchs from previous episodes. He documented several detailed incidents of Native women being kidnapped, all by Sasquatch figures, the Choanito, Scanicum, and Chweniti, most occurring in the late 1800s and early 1900s. These stories are far from vague. The following is cited from Chweniti and the Stick Indians of the Colvilles. He wrote, quote, "The Sasquatch was known by the Spokane Indians to interact also with human females. One girl was kidnapped by the Chweniti people and was not returned until she was a grown woman. When returned, she was found asleep along the banks of a stream, and upon being awakened, she could not remember where she had been for the long period of time she had been missing."
Maybe hypnotism?
Maybe.
We know that they do that.
Another similar story A native man was on a trail when he had his run-in. He was ascending a hill in the very early morning. He suddenly smelled a Chwiniti. He knew one was near because they smell really, really bad.
Yeah, literally.
He saw a shadow of a huge man nearby in the low-lit trees. After this, he remembers nothing for the rest of the day. His awareness returned suddenly in the later afternoon, and he was heading home when it happened, coincidentally, on the same trail. He didn't tell anyone about the stinky shadow, and he believed he was hypnotized by the Chwiniti, but doesn't know why it happened. Maybe the girl found by the river had been taken from the same spot.
Maybe.
Hypnosis Creek.
I know that they do it to animals. Everybody knows that, but it's like, what's the purpose?
To continue quoting Ed Fuchs from his book, in another case, a young virgin of marriageable age suddenly disappeared. The Chwiniti was reported to like the smell of virgins. An intense search was conducted, but to no avail. After being gone for a considerable period of time, reported as 2 to 3 years, she was returned. When returned, she was not wearing the same clothes as when she left. She smelled so strongly of the wild man that her own people could hardly get near her. She was fed and cared for, but had to be kept outside. Because of the smell, none of the men wanted her. She was never in her right mind again, being completely mentally disoriented and appeared to be more animal than human. But she was not vicious, and was able to give some account of where she had been, and she had not been molested. Molested here as in sexually attacked to the modern meaning.
Yeah, as compared to Point and Adeline's meaning.
The strangest, most jarring kidnapping story documented by Dr. Ed Fuchs comes from a 60-year-old Lakes Band woman named Frances and her mother Laura. Frances and her mother say they are relatives to a woman who was kidnapped by a Scanicum. As a child, she was strongly interested in the Scanicum. She had heard the wailing of the Scanicum first when she was 6. She was obsessed ever since then. She asked her grandparents questions about the beings, and they passed on dozens of stories to her. As she aged, she discovered she had a closer connection to Scanicum than she thought. So this is Laura and Frances' story. In the summer-autumn months of 1900, the Lakes Band village set up a long-term camp for fishing season near the Keller Sandpole River. During the day, the men fished and hunted, coming home tired, and at night, women processed the fish and game and made dinner. One evening, a newlywed bride, through bride purchase, went to fetch water. It's possible she may not have known that women could never be alone in the woods. Minutes later, her screams could be heard. Men rushed to the river and they saw Scanicum carrying her away. As she was being carried off, she ripped off a piece of her white slip, leaving behind a piece of her for her new tribe to follow. They wanted to save her, but the risk was too great. The Scanicum was vengeful. If he was harmed, the captive may be injured. Plus, the mountains were so treacherous, finding her would be impossible. They decided not to pursue her. Then, that way, her life could be spared. However, her husband and other men did not give up on finding her. Months later, she was spotted in a clearing by the weary search party. She was collecting potatoes when they saw her. Her Scanicum abductor was nearby, taking a nap.
Bruh. Like, the same as the other one that was like...
Oh, he's just like laying there and they strap him down.
Yeah. Like, they're just like, yep. Like,
well, I mean, no one's gonna... You would think no one would bother them, but...
I would think you would sleep in a cave. You're like...
Well, he's waiting for...
Secret.
He's waiting for the lady to get potatoes.
Yeah, I guess he was watching and then he's like... I mean...
He's like, I'll be up soon. Just keep getting potatoes.
I guess daytime is their nighttime, just like a ghost. That's what they... It's not true, but...
Or an owl.
Have you heard people say that?
No.
They're like, yeah, when the day turns to night, the nighttime is the time for ghosts to be like active, like, because it's their daytime. And then when the sun comes up, it's their nighttime. And it's like, I have been harassed by a ghost at all times of the day and night. I don't think they fucking sleep.
Yeah, they're kind of dead.
Yeah, they're like
they don't
dead.
do nighttime.
They don't do shit like that. They'll be stupid.
Thanks, though.
You know who does do that, though? Sasquatch.
That's true.
And Scanicum.
So, yeah, she's getting potatoes. He's taking a nap. The men approached slowly on horseback, and as soon as she saw the men, she dropped the potatoes and ran. She flew onto one of the horses, and they ran away. Upon their return to camp, the entire group broke down camp and headed back home.
They're like, fuck, we gotta go.
Yeah, we got her. We're leaving.
Yeah.
She told them about what had happened to her while with the Scanicum. Her abductor took her to his cave, and there was a group of Scanicum living there. She was basically their prisoner. She was always supervised. She gathered roots nearly every day, which is a staple in the Scanicum diet. They ate other food, the same as other natives. She claimed they had a drying and storing system for their food, and they built fires with flintstone. They had many animal hides that they used as beds. She thinks they were stolen, though. She shared disturbing news with her husband and the others. Eventually, she was forced to become the wife of her abductor. Worst of all, she had become pregnant. Only a few months after being rescued, she gave birth to a boy. The baby survived, and she named him Patrick.
Patrick.
Stump? Last year wishes on this is apology. Every last time I come home. He's so
Take
weird.
my last thing to gonna bread or two.
Yeah. This is not that Patrick.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's-
maybe it is, but I don't think it is.
No, I don't think so either. So, Patrick, the Scanicum boy, he was obviously strange in appearance. His body was misproportioned and he was very ugly, very ugly. That's like the one thing they're like, he was hideous.
Oh.
And strangely, he was short, about 5'4".
Short for a Scanicum.
Yeah,
Not short for
a person.
person, yeah.
I mean, he was short for, I think, a person or at least a man at that time.
An adult man.
Yeah, 5'4".
Was he 5'4" as an adult?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. He had a kind of stooped posture, and he possibly had been a hunchback.
Dude, the listener should see me right now. I'm like, huh.
Hunchback status.
I'm like the letter C. That's what I look like.
So he was a hunchback, unfortunately. And he had long arms that fell all the way down to his knees, which is very peculiar. And he had very big hands with weird long fingers. He had a sloping forehead and a very large lower jaw. And his mouth was described as too wide with straight, thin lips. And he had straight protruding teeth. He also had elongated ears that pointed upwards. So if you can imagine like elf ears, but they bent downward at the top, like a dog with floppy ears.
Oh, weird. Okay.
Yeah. And his eyes were very squinted, and he had dark, dark eyes. So although Patrick's body was abnormal, his mind, however, was not. He was actually extremely intelligent and very gentle and kind. And he became a very successful rancher and very affluent. He had no problem getting married, even though he was deformed. And the woman he married was Laura's blood cousin. So they were related to Patrick by marriage. And Laura's daughter, Frances, remembers meeting him once as a very little girl. So Patrick, with his wife, he had 3 daughters, Mary Louise, Madeline, and Stella. But Stella had died when she was a child.
Okay.
Doesn't really say what she died from. I'm just assuming illness because the other children were very healthy. So both Mary Louise and Madeline had obvious Scanicum features as well. They had wide mouths like their father, described as ear to ear, maybe even wider than their father's. And they also had protruding teeth and very squinty eyes. And Mary Louise looked fairly normal, actually, like she was kind of passing, but Madeline was not. So Madeline possessed other distinct features. She had a sloping forehead. She had the long peaked ears, and she was considered to be very ugly by Indian standards, quote unquote. A man from the Columbia Moses Band named Louis said he had known Patrick his entire life. They were very close friends. They grew up together, and was also close with his wife and daughters. Louis said about Patrick, he was a very good man. He was a very good card player. He seemed to somehow know what everyone else was holding. Psychic
Powers.
spiritual powers. So although Patrick was kind and respected, Patrick's family still had a reputation, and people talked behind their backs because they were, quote, part Scanicum, and nothing could change that. Patrick died when he was 30 years old, leaving his family behind. And the cause of his death is not known. He was a rancher, so it very much well could have been that. He was remembered as being a successful and honest man who never raised a hand to his wife or his children. With their father being deceased and their mother never speaking about the rumors whatsoever, the girls never really got any answers, and they always wondered if the gossip was true. It's sad to think that they grew up being like treated differently and being called a scanicum, basically monsters, and being so different that like you'll never belong anywhere. Mary Louise lived the rest of her life on the reservation. She got married and had children, and her children also had scanicum features, but maybe not as much. And she had developed a very close relationship with her Auntie Laura, who was cousins to her mother. In the early 1980s, after Mary Louise's mother passed away, Mary Louise began to spend several summers with Laura and Francis, looking for answers about who she was, as well as answers for who or what her father really was. She knew of the rumors her whole life that she was part scanicum, and Laura would give her validation that the rumors were true, and then told her the story. However, Madeline's path was completely different. As a young adult, she moved away to the Washington coast, and it was rumored that she became a very bad alcoholic, and she spent most of her time at taverns. It's unclear if she ever married or had children, and her family would never have regular contact with her again. So for many years to follow, Laura, her daughter Frances, and eventually her grandchildren would have experiences of their own with wild scanicum. There were many occasions where they heard the howling and whooping from the scanicum, and actually Laura drove by a scanicum woman once. The wild woman had the same features of the scanicum, but also looked humanish. Another time she came into close contact with a man scanicum, and Laura claims the wild man tried to converse with her, making organized sounds, speaking a language she didn't know. After he tried to speak to her, she just fucking fled in fear. Yeah, like she's like, I don't want to get abducted, but he did not pursue her. From these stories, we can assume that the purpose of kidnapping Native women for generations is for Sasquatch to look for wives, new wives, just like Patrick's wild father was. And in the late 1800s, a Squamish man named John Adams told an anthropologist something very interesting when you actually take Patrick's story into consideration. John Adams would speak about stick Indians, and he's asked if they really exist. And he states, "There are none left. They were killed off. It's just that they all became civilized. Some of our own people had them as ancestors. One of my cousins had a sharp face and was a terrible man, and that was because he was part wild man."
So let's continue with the story of Seraphine Long. Seraphine Long was a Chehalis woman who shared her testimony with J.W. Burns sometime in the early 1930s. She passed away not long after giving her testimony. The year is 1871 and Seraphine is 17 years old. The story goes as follows. I was walking towards home one day carrying a big bundle of cedar roots, and I was thinking about the young brave Qualic Thunderbolt I was soon to marry. Suddenly, at a place where the bush grew close and thick beside the trail, a long arm shot out and a big hairy hand was pressed over my mouth. Then I was suddenly lifted up into the arms of a young Sasquatch. I was terrified. I fought and struggled with all my might. In those days I was very strong, but it was no good. The wild man was as powerful as a young bear. Holding me easily under one arm, with his other hand he smeared tree gum, some sap, over my eyes, sticking them shut so I could not see where he was taking me. He then lifted me to his shoulder and started to run. He ran on and on for a long, long time, up and down hills, through thick brush, across many streams, never stopping to rest. Once he had to swim the river, and then perhaps I could have gotten away, but I was so afraid of being drowned that I held on tightly with my arms about his neck. Although I was frightened, I could not help but admire his easy breathing, his great strength, and speed of foot. After reaching the other side of the river, he began to climb and climb. Presently the air became very cold. I could not see, but I guessed we were close to the top of Mount Morris. As the Sasquatch stopped hurrying, he then stooped over and moved slowly, as if he was feeling his way along a tunnel. Presently, he laid me down quite gently, and I could hear people talking in a strange tongue I could not understand. The young giant then wiped the sticky tree gum from my eyelids, and I was able to look around me. I sat up and saw that I was in a great big cave. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch, and much better preserved than we preserved them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave for all the light there was. As my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, I saw beside the young giant that brought me into the cave, there were 2 other wild people, a man and a woman. To me, a young girl, they seemed very, very old, but they were active and friendly, and later I learned they were the parents of the young Sasquatch who had stolen me. When they came over to look at me, I cried and asked them to let me go. They just smiled and shook their heads. From then on, I was kept a close prisoner. Not once did they let me go out of the cave. One of them always stayed with me when the other 2 were away. They fed me well on roots, fish, and meat, and after I learned a few words of their tongue, which was not unlike the Douglas dialect.
Interesting. Like the Hadza with Charlie Victor.
Once I had learned a few words of their tongue, I asked the young giant how he caught and killed the deer, mountain goats, and sheep that he often brought into the cave. He smiled, opening and closing his big hairy hands. I guess he had just laid in wait, and when an animal got close enough, he leapt, caught it, and choked it to death. He was certainly big enough, quick enough, and strong enough to do so.
Also very interesting. Do you think it was like this?
No, I think like this.
Oh.
What I'm thinking is like palms up and then like closing your hands.
Yeah.
Almost like a come here kind of motion, but just like take. She continues, when I had been in the cave for about a year, I began to feel very sick and weak and could not eat much. I told this to the young Sasquatch and pleaded with him to take me back to my own people. At first he got very angry, as did his father and mother, but I kept on pleading with them, telling them that I wished to see my own people again before I died. I really was ill, and I suppose they could see that for themselves. Then, one day, after I cried for a long time, the young Sasquatch went outside and returned with a leaf full of tree gum. With this, he stuck my eyelids as he had done before. Then again, he lifted me to his big shoulder. The return journey was like a very bad dream, for I was lightheaded and in much pain. When we recrossed the wide river, I was almost swept away. I was too weak to cling to the young Sasquatch, but he held me with one big hand and swam with the other. Close to my home, he put me down and gently removed the tree gum from my eyelids. When he saw that I could see again, he shook his head sadly, pointed to my house, and then turned back into the forest. My people were all wildly excited when I stumbled back into the house, for they had long given me up as dead. I was too sick and weak to talk. I just managed to crawl into bed, and that night I gave birth to a child. The little one only lived for a few hours, for which I've always been thankful. I hope that never again shall I see a Sasquatch. Stories of experiences like Seraphine Long's or the nameless mother of Gentle Patrick, they're obviously devastating and tragic, but it's obviously not a surprise to see stories and testimonies like Seraphine's published in newspapers, journals, tabloids, in the most tasteless, demented, sensationalized light, or why Patrick's family secret was kept under wraps. For example, there's a clip from a newspaper article printed only a year or so after Seraphine Long's story was publicized, and it's called Boogeyman of Indian Tribe Appears Again in Harrison Mills, British Columbia, March 3rd, 1934. Indian children clung to their mother's apron strings today, for the terrible Sasquatch, a giant, hairy and horrid, is on the prowl again. For hundreds of years, the Sasquatch has been a fearsome boogeyman to the Northwest Indians. None have been reported for 30 years, but horrors swept the lodges of the primitive Stehelis tribe today, as word was whispered that the hairy one had returned.
It's a gross fucking thing to say.
Yeah. The article continues. Frank Dan was first to report sighting the monster. He was out in the night to see why his dog was barking so furiously when he came face to face with a hairy giant, tall, muscular, and nude. Like, okay, calm down. This Sasquatch, as well as other demons, are real to the Stehelis. They are things of horror, emerging to snatch an Indian girl into the unknown and to devour Indian babies.
And that was like only one of a few that I found. I decidedly did not include others. There's no point in reading offensive like articles over and over and over again. This one was enough.
Yeah, that kind of narrative. Mm-hmm. You've also shared with me, it's a It's a vintage postcard from the 40s or 50s, and it depicts a strange scene of a young native girl being kidnapped by a Sasquatch. The girl is seen being carried under the arm of a Sasquatch, and the Sasquatch is hairy and apish, and he's drooling, and he has like dopey eyes. And the girl is depicted as the stereotype of the Indian princess. Like, her cheeks are rouged, her lips are red, she's dressed in like a tight beaded dress with feathers in her hair, and her expression is like damsel in shock, damsel in distress, where she's like, oh no.
Yeah.
And the caption says, quote, "The Sasquatch has been a seemingly harmless bystander. In the last 75 years, the only reports of human encounter has been the kidnapping of an Indian maiden and a prospector." It's clear that the cartoon's supposed to be funny, like the way that the Sasquatch looks and the way the lady looks, but it's not funny. It's degrading. It's gross. It's offensive.
Yeah. So, in general, the appropriation of the Indigenous Sasquatch has contributed to harmful Indigenous tropes and stereotypes. And like historically, it's overlooked, in my opinion. I feel like some people are like, how? Why would that? Blah, blah, blah. But to argue that media and art like this vintage postcard isn't racist is just implying that comedic and performative blackface was harmless and didn't contribute to racist stereotypes. I think it's the same. The exaggerated trope of kidnapping Indigenous women has become a popular and harmful theme. Whether it be Sasquatch or pirates or colonizers as the aggressors, it makes money. This trope, along with others that revolve around the violent degradation of Indigenous women, have been pounded into our society. And it's really normalized the idea that sexy Native women are meant to be owned, abused, or in need of rescue. So, like the aforementioned Sasquatch and Indian maiden, the message is pretty clear. Her fate is to be raped by a monster, and it's funny. That's like a harsh way to say that, but when you look at it, that's the honest truth of that. Not all artists' renditions are supposed to be comical. There's one piece in particular which portrays a totally different scene, and this is a rendition that you see a lot when you find articles or when you look at stuff that is involved with Seraphine Long. It tends to be partnered with this image. In this piece of media, it's there's a Sasquatch, and he's like portrayed as a looming dark shadow with like a human face, and he's wading through the waters of a river carrying a Native woman. And she is unconscious and limp and vulnerable. And she has like long dark hair hanging down. And her clothing is soaking wet and it's torn and it's like falling off her body. And her upper thighs are exposed and her collarbone is exposed. And like in this image, she looks beautiful in some way. And she just looks peacefully graceful while being unconscious. And her simple design is suggestive that she will also be assaulted, but this time it won't be funny, it'll be sexy. There are other renditions that feature Sasquatch abducting other women, not just Indigenous women, but there are many of white women too. And we see this in media, we see this in movies too, where any woman who's sexy is getting abducted by Sasquatch. There was actually one thing that I found of like a movie. Like the cover is like a Sasquatch and he's like holding a motorcycle or throwing something. He's like powerful, right? And then it says, Sasquatch, it'll breed with anything.
Oh yeah, I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah. So one illustration in particular that I've included is from the late 1890s, and it kind of paints a similar scenario to the sexy one from before. There's a limp, blonde-haired white woman, and she's being carried by a Sasquatch. And this Sasquatch is depicted like a gorilla or like a giant ape. It's like it's completely different. And she is depicted as being turned away from the viewer, and her face is concealed, but her clothing is hanging off her body, and her shoulders are exposed. And, you know, you can't see it, but it's kind of suggested that her bare chest is exposed as well, but she's totally like turned. And from this description, it would be assumed that her fate is to be the same as the others, but it's not, because in the background, there is a hunting party, and they are armed with rifles in pursuit of the beast to rescue her, and her fate is to be saved. she's protected by her father and brothers and husband. And with her face and breasts concealed from the viewer, her purity and chastity remains intact. And unfortunately, our other examples show Native women that aren't lucky. However, there is a chance they can be saved if they are Princess Tiger Lily or Pocahontas. As an Indian princess, her beauty and status makes her worthy of rescue. And sometimes that rescue is not from a captor, like Sasquatch or like Captain Hook. You know, it's a rescue from her people, like Pocahontas. You know, even in the Disney movie, she's destined to marry Kocoum, but she doesn't want to marry Kocoum. She wants to marry John Smith. She is the perfect candidate for marriage and child rearing, and she's saved with religion and a civilized way of life. It's a rescue from her culture and her identity. I read a really compelling article. It's actually in our sightings for this series that was written by a Native woman who's a scholar. She wrote this heartbreaking essay. And this is where I got a lot of this perspective, because I understand what the Princess Tiger Lily and squaw stereotypes are, but never really from this intense perspective.
Yeah. Sounds like it kind of went more into the actual cause and effect, the mechanics systemically of what this all does.
Right.
Just awful.
It is awful. It's disturbing. The Indian princess stereotype is kind of more seen in media, but also in the same publication or the same essay. It exists in a way where they can be rescued from the res, and then that way her status is changed.
And just in the same way that a lot of brown and black women are seen fetishized as a novelty, where there's the geisha.
Right.
There's also the Indian princess. I feel like it goes without saying, but one of the pieces of colonization is the plundering of women as a resource, as wives, as novelty, Yeah.
If she is not the young Indian princess, she is the old squaw. That's the other side of the spectrum. And today, this stereotype devalues the lives of Native women, and they exist only as, quote, alcoholics, addicts, and sexual objects. She is unruly and promiscuous and dirty. That's the stereotype. And it continues that she likes to drink and is without dignity. And she's unintelligent and morally bankrupt, without faith. And she's unfit for marriage because she is without value. I spent, like I said, over a year reading a lot of publications, reading a lot of essays on this stuff to get a better perspective about where this violence comes from, because this violence exists. According to the U.S. Department of Interior Indian Affairs, there was a study between 2009 and 2021, and it showed that in the U.S., 84% of Indigenous women and girls reported experiencing violence in their lifetime so far. Over 50% of those have been victims of sexual violence.
That statistic is disgustingly shocking. That's so 84%.
Right. And then over half of them, not only physical,
but sexual
violence. And homicide is the 6th leading cause of death for Indigenous women between the ages of 20 and 44. While the U.S. population of Indigenous women is around 3%, they're 10 times more likely to be murdered than non-natives, especially in counties with higher ratios of white men to women. According to the National Institute of Justice, reports on violence against Indigenous women showed 97% of the women surveyed stated their perpetrators were non-Indigenous men, which is disturbing.
You know what? I've never worried about a Filipino person attacking me. Just saying.
Yeah, that's a good point.
An Asian of any kind, actually. From any gender.
From any gender or generation.
Or generation, yep.
Yeah.
I've always been scared of white people.
And also, I think it's worth mentioning, if you do have an interest in true crime, I highly suggest there's a YouTube documentary by the Oregonian, and it's called The Ghosts of Highway 20. And it is about God, what the fuck is his name? He was like a pretty prolific serial killer in Oregon, and he worked for ODOT, which is the Oregon Department of Transportation.
His name was John Arthur Ackroyd, and he was a highway mechanic with ODOT.
Yeah. And so he was very familiar with Highway 20 and the Mackenzie and Santiam, and I think 58 as well. But I think he mostly worked on Highway 20. And his first known victim was a woman who was like in her late teens, early 20s. She wasn't 21 yet, and she was an Indigenous woman. And she was married to a white guy, and she had just had her first baby. And she was at the Sisters Rodeo. This was back in the 80s, I think, 70s.
It was 77.
77.
Her name was Marlene Gabrielson.
Yeah. And she had gotten a little bit inebriated, and she wasn't over 21 yet. And so she was afraid to get in trouble, and she had gotten into an argument with her husband. And so she was looking for a ride. She was going to hitchhike, and Ackroyd picked her up and he attacked her, but then he drove her home, all the way home. And she immediately went to the hospital and told them what happened, and nothing came of it.
Yeah, it says she had a rape kit, she had the bruises, everything supported her story, but the guy didn't get prosecuted. And they only interviewed her again after other people went missing.
Yeah. This is kind of graphic. I don't know if I'm going to keep this in, but he had torn her jeans down to her boots. That's what she said. And then she came home with her jeans torn down to her boots. And her story is really, really harrowing. It's very disturbing, but it's very, very harrowing. And she's still alive today. She rides a motorcycle. She's
Hell yeah.
amazed. But she says herself that, quote, "No one thought that I was nothing more than a drunk Indian. She just wanted to get home to her baby. She went to go get help. And because no one took her seriously, other women died, including a 12-year-old girl, his stepdaughter." The CDC also mentions that Indigenous women are twice as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than non-Native women. And these contributing factors are systemic barriers to care, poverty, and historical trauma.
Evil shit.
If you've ever struggled or had trauma that has to do with anything reproductive, it sticks with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, even being a person with any level of privilege, going through reproductive care, having trauma is extremely difficult. So imagine that, and then having all of these other obstacles against you.
Yeah.
Would it be impossible?
Impossible. So in Canada, 80% of First Nations women reported experiencing violence in their lifetimes, very similar to the US. And over 50% of those women had been victims to sexual violence, in the US as well. And while the population of First Nations people make up less than 3% of Canada, First Nations women make up 16% of all women's homicides. And 11% make up for all missing women entirely. So if there's 100 missing women, 11 of them are Indigenous women.
That's huge.
Yeah. So about 4 in every 100,000 Indigenous women are murdered, which is 6 times higher than non-natives.
So for every one non-native person who dies, 6 Indigenous women die.
Mm-hmm. And they make up less than 3% of the population.
Yeah. Just
of the entirety of Canada.
Outrageously high rate of murder and missing.
Yeah. So that's it's all disturbing. None of it is right. All of it is injustice. And it's so sad to see other women being hurt that way in general, regardless. But we also cannot exclude Two-Spirit natives either. So if you don't know what Two-Spirit means, the term Two-Spirits first appeared in the 1990s, and it was actually introduced to the public by Indigenous people. And Two-Spirits exists in a contemporary context, and it represents natives who fulfill another gender role, like those who are transgender, non-binary, etc. And in some sources, at least when it was first introduced as well, depending on the tribe or nation, it was all LGBT people in general were considered to be two-spirit. And for centuries, collective Indigenous people of North America have recognized two-spirit people and understood them to be special individuals who were born spiritually divine. Mm-hmm. That was a word that I saw a lot. They were spiritually divine. And through assimilation and religion, cultural eradication, two-spirit's identity was rejected and punished. And today, unsurprisingly, two-spirit people are victims of extreme violence at an astronomical rate. And according to Tribal Information Exchange, 78 to 85% of two-spirit people experience gender-based violence, both sexual and physical. And across the board, trans people are 4 times more likely to be victims of violence, and well over half of those victims are people of color.
In the present, we can see that the Indigenous people of this entire continent have suffered greatly throughout history, and because of systemic barriers and oppression, they continue to struggle collectively. As non-natives, us, it's important to not just recognize that, but to actually understand that. However, it is important to recognize North America's Indigenous people have also strived at great lengths to reclaim what they have lost. They are empowered, they are passionate, and they are succeeding, and they have done it all on their own. Robert Jago is a First Nations activist and member of the Nooksack tribe, and he published a very educational episode about Sasquatch on the CANADALAND podcast. And Amber, you just showed me their podcast cover, and it's like a decapitated white guy, and it's great.
Yeah. I don't really know, I'm like, that's
it's like the head of a white guy.
Yeah, it's like bright yellow.
His simple 30-minute episode brought so much clarity in regards to the appropriation of Stehelis culture and Sasquatch, all from an Indigenous point of view. Quote, "The Canada of the 1930s was virtually Stalinist in its treatment of Indigenous peoples. No freedom of movement, no freedom of speech, no freedom to choose what job you wanted to do, no freedom of mobility. The residential school systems were at their deadliest worst, and on top of that, it was illegal to practice your faith and your culture. J.W. Burns took Stehelis masks, told the story in Maclean magazine, and toured the country for profit, and the Stehelis played along. Why? Because when it came to Sasquatch, an exception was made. And today, the Stehelis, in effect, appropriated appropriation. Today, the Stehelis are thriving, loudly and publicly. The Sasquatch is recognized as the official totem of the Stehelis tribe, and is the proud and prominent figure on their tribal flag. In 2013, after 70 years, the Museum of Vancouver returned the traditional Sasquatch mask to the Stehelis. 4 years later, the Harrison Visitor Center Sasquatch Museum opened to the public. The centuries-old mask currently resides at the museum and is prominently on display alongside many others. Since the museum's opening, with open arms and open hearts, the Stehelis have embraced the curious minds of outsiders, confidently educating their visitors through sharing their heritage and history. They've had the power to show the world their remarkable truth, but that's not all. Every summer, the Stehelis host the Sasquatch Days Festival. It's open invitation to locals and tourists. The festival includes Sasquatch procession with prayer and song, traditional dance from the Stehelis Sasquatch dancers, canoe racing, salmon barbecue and bannock luck, free medicine walks. A medicine walk is a ceremony-based practice of healing. It involves being open to the land and oneself while journeying in nature. And then there's open vendors and artisans. There's jewelry, art, pottery, literature, clothes, food. And this is Stehelis pride. And as non-natives, we are so lucky to be given an invitation to attend something like this.
Literally, I want to go so bad. I honestly am thinking about getting my passport.
Yeah.
Just to go. How amazing would that be?
Really fucking generous of them.
Really generous.
Yeah.
Really, really generous.
It should also be known that the Stehelis are not just welcoming, they're also accepting. They embrace the modern form of Sasquatch, both the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch and the American Bigfoot, because Pacific Northwest Sasquatch and American Bigfoot are cherished by the Stehelis too, just the same as he's cherished by all of us in the Pacific Northwest. And these modern figures have become part of their heritage. so no one should feel ashamed by Sasquatch. Kelsey Charlie, a Stehelis band counselor, tells a story in which he saw 2 Sasquatch drinking water from Harrison Lake back in 2002. The experience was clear as day to him. At first, he didn't want to tell anyone he saw them, fearing disbelief. He said, quote, "You don't want to have people looking at you in a certain way. Then again, I thought, awem, squele well, which in our language means you're proud of who you are, where you come from, and what you belong to." I think Sasquatch resonates because all cultures in the world have something like a supernatural being, and through time and evolution and humanness, we've lost a lot of these things. People just don't believe. He recites what his grandfather had once told him as a boy. Quote, "Seeing a Sasquatch is considered a blessing or a sign of good luck. If you're able to see him, hear him, or see his footprints, there's some type of good fortune that's going to come your way, because he's making sure that you know that he's there and that you still have to live by the rules to live in harmony with nature. They live off the land, they live on the land, they are the land. Sasquatch is the caretaker of the Stehelis, the Harrison River Valley, the Pacific Northwest itself, and honestly the entire continent. Collectively, we should have pride in him, but most of all, we should honor where he comes from, North America's indigenous people." And we can quote Robert Jago from CANADALAND once more. He says, "It is not our way to try and possess something like the truth, not exclusively. The truth as we know it as Native people is everyone's truth. It's just that because we've been here so long, we know more of it. And that's a fact that non-Indigenous people need to accept, especially as they move further into our spaces, whether physical, moral, or cultural. So the truth is this: we do not know everything, we do not own everything, and not everything has been tamed."
Our huge 4-part Sasquatch series for Indigenous Heritage Month was a topic which began as, like I said, a small one, a 15-page single episode document about the oppressive appropriation of a sacred figure which once belonged to North America's indigenous people. But in the end, our 48-page series naturally redirected its course, focusing instead on indigenous people's reclamation and reappropriation of their own identities, history, heritage, and culture, spotlighting their stories and respecting their beliefs. And like stated before, it is paramount we recognize the many centuries of suffering indigenous people have been forced to endure, as well as understand how this continued oppression is still happening today, a result of hundreds of years of generational trauma and forced assimilation, hidden behind the walls of systematic persecution. But what is far more important is understanding that indigenous people should not be boiled down to being helpless victims. They should be revered as a group of people who are righteously taking back what is theirs. They are empowered and passionate. They are rebuilding and they're thriving and they're growing. And they deserve respect, not pity. Painted rock was excavated and artifacts were stolen. Now the sacred site belongs to the Tule River Reservation. Sarah Winnemucca told of the Northern Paiutes' great victory, once thought to be a myth, now believed to be true. Sasquatch, the most universally recognized cryptid in the world, is being reclaimed by the Stehelis, and their forgotten voices are not so silent anymore. So we close this series with a few more stories from indigenous people from an array of tribes. Enjoy these stories.
When I was I'd say about 11 years old, me and my younger brothers and cousins and friends, we were out in our chicken coop that wasn't quite finished, so the windows were open. And we were playing in there. It was kind of cold. It was in March. And we were flying a kite, and we only had one kite, so we were all huddled around this one kite. And we let it out as far as it could go, and then as we were reeling it back in because we started to get cold, one of the kids, he looked this way. He looked down the road, and he said, "Who's that guy watching us over there?" And we all looked, and we were like, we didn't know who it was, but whatever or whoever it was, he was really big. He was tall, taller than our little fence pole, came up to him about to here. And the fence pole we later found out was about 5 foot something, maybe 8. He looked kind of hairy. He had no neck. His neck was really short like that. And he seemed like he had really long arms. Because he would stand there and watch us, and every now and then he'd lean over like this. And then he'd stand back up and watch us some more. And we were frantically winding in our kite, and we wouldn't let it go. And then it started to snow a little bit. And as it got more and more snow, his coloring, it became gray from the snow. But he stood there, and then finally one of my little brothers, he said, I'm going to go tell Dad. So he ran out of the door and was heading around the corner, and within that split second, it was gone. It ran into the trees. So it disappeared like just in a blink of an eye. We've heard of the boogeyman and the Earthsea, the monster. And, you know, our parents scared us with those mythical creatures. But we never heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and we called it the big black figure. I was born in 55, so I was about 11 or 12, so about 67 maybe. And there was about 8 of us, 8 kids that we all seen it. And it never really came around again. And in the sighting that I'm going to tell you about now was my brother Ed. He was hunting on his horse. He had a rifle on his back, and he was hunting. Then he decided, well, I'm going to try one more place to see if I can find something. And so he goes over this ridge, and he said everything happened like in a split second. It was like slow motion, he said. And what happened was him and his horse came over the ridge, and he said he saw the horse's ears go like that, and it just stopped. And then they all looked at each other, and at the very bottom, way down there was this Bigfoot sitting down there, and he was eating something like that. And he was eating some off the ground, and then he looked up at him like that. And he said the look that that Bigfoot gave them was the look of murder. That's how he described it to me. And he said that thing just came up on all fours, like just leaped. He said like within 4 leaps, he was already halfway up, just boom, boom, boom. And he said he could actually see the muscles rippling and the hair and that look in its eyes. And he said it was fast. He said it just bound up at him. And in that instant, that horse did that with his ears. He just turned like that. And my brother almost fell off, and he grabbed that horse's neck. He said he couldn't stop his horse for nothing. This old rancher guy lived out in the Red Canyon area by Trout Creek. And he said he came home to his trailer one night, and he said he seen it as he pulled in. He seen it. It was in the field, and he had an old car, and he saw it, and it ducked, and it was trying to hide behind this big sagebrush, but the sagebrush couldn't hide it. And so he put his headlights are on it, and he starts panicking. He got scared of it, and he's trying to back out. And he backed out, and he was trying to go, and he got stuck. And so he's stuck, and his headlights are still aimed at that thing that he sees. And so he's finally gets it in gear, and he takes off. But he said it was really big, and it was really fast. And he did notice it jumping on the sagebrush as it ran off. And then the next day, or a few days later, he found his horses. They were laying in a gully, and I actually saw the horses. And they were, I would say it was a massacre. It was a little ravine, a little gully, and there was 4 dead horses in there. And what had happened was their necks were all ripped out, just about, a horse neck. Yeah. That big was just a rip on all of them. And also their butt, their tail end area, they were all ripped. And they were just laid out and dead. And whatever killed them had to have been fast, because if you imagine horses, they're pretty fast. And if something's being attacked, the other ones are going to go, but it got all of them. My sister, they live by the river, and a lot of times their horses were being bothered by something outside, and they would, have that. They'd go out and try to scare it off, and sometimes there'd be a bad odor outside. But I remember one time they lived in this little old house, and they had left. And the kids were home with their uncle who was in college, and they were in the house, and they said something climbed on the top of the house, and it was big, whatever it was, really big, and it was walking around and jumping around. And they got really scared of it, and so the college student, he got them all together, and they were crying, and he put them in the middle of the room, and they had their gun. He got a gun, a rifle, and he was aiming at the door and looking for whatever was up, bouncing around and stomping, and he said it was doing that for a while, and the kids were just crying. And then it went to this kitchen area, which is kind of low. It was about 8 feet, and they said it was really jumping hard over there. Then it went back, and just then Beatrice came home, and that thing took off, jumped off the house and took off. And the CISO, he didn't realize that it was that they had come home, and when she opens the door, there they are facing a rifle aimed at them. And she was like, "What's going on?" And the kids were hysterical. But another one, I actually remember this one, was my niece, George. She was, we were washing dishes, and at that time we had to heat water, then dump the basin water out onto the porch. And so she went outside to dump her dishwater, and we had this old black truck parked, and we had trash in it, just so we can take it to the dump. And she said when she walked out, there was something big leaning into it, and it was eating, and she said it was making like an ugly slurping noise. And then it looked up at her, and she just screamed and threw her little basin of water and just ran back in. And she said it really smelled bad outside too when she opened the door, and they kind of seen each other. But she wouldn't empty water for a long time.
So my name is Maria Parker Pasqua, and I live in Nia Bay. From Nia Bay, the village of Ozette. And I'm learning Makah. I also teach Makah to youth and adult classes. So Sasquatch stories have gone back years and years and years. But as long as we've been here, which our ancestors say since the beginning of time, this being has also been here. And his name is Tsetsawaxil. That's what we call him. Tsetsawaxil means one eye, because apparently there must have been one that just had one eye. And then the whole group of them became known as Tsetsawaxil, one eyes. There's a number of stories, but the one that I think really represents connection with our tribe is the one I can tell you. So a long time ago, the people were, it was time for smoking the fish, so probably fall time. They were getting the fish ready, and it was when they hard dried the salmon, and so they're filleted out and braces put in them, sticks put in them, and then hung in the smokehouse to dry. And there was a family that had their smokehouse going, and of course someone had to get up during the night to add more wood to the fire, and occasionally you would have to move the salmon that were just above the fire and get the ones that were further away and switch them so they all got equal amount of smoke. And so the person that was in charge of that, he did his job, he did that. When he went out to add fire, he noticed there was like a whole row of salmon missing. And he thought that was strange, because usually people respected one another or didn't steal. If you stole, that was really low. And it was just not considered a good way to be. And they couldn't believe someone stole some of their fish. And so the person in the house said, well, we have to have somebody, we'll have to lock it or something. You'll have to tie it from the inside. And so the next night they tied it so that the door, the entryway wouldn't be able to be easily accessed, and went up through the smoke hole. And he came out the top on the roof and came down and thought, oh, no one will get it now because we've done this. And the next morning when they went to check the smokehouse, sure enough, the door was still closed. So they someone went up and through the place where the roof board's open, that makes a smoke hole, and went down. And it was still tied from the inside, yet there was some fish missing. And they thought, what is going on? And so the people in the house talked about it, and the elder person said, well, we'll need to have someone watch tonight, put someone on watch. And so they tried to do the same thing after they had enough wood in the fire. They tied it from the inside, and the person got out the smoke hole, and the person who had watched said, okay, I'll watch carefully. I'll stay up all night and make sure nothing happens. And he sat kind of away so he's out of sight, like at the corner of the house or something where he's not visible much. And he kept watch all night. And he didn't even hear them come because they can move in anywhere very quietly. And it's like they just appeared. And there was a group of Sasquatch. And they kind of tried to move the door, and they're so strong they could have just broken, but they didn't destroy the place. They had a little one, and they just put him up on the roof and motioned for him to go down. And so the little one went up through the roof, and he started getting, he didn't disturb anything in the house other than they wanted the fish. And he started throwing some of the dried fish up through the hole. And so the Sasquatch would get it, and when they got kind of a pile of it, they had him climb up again, and they helped him down, and they took off. But they used the little one to go in the smoke hole because they were huge and heavy, but the little one could do it, and off they went. And so the person who was watchman, he didn't try to stop them. There was a whole group of them, and he just observed what they did. And the next morning he told everybody, he said, well, I see who's doing this. He says, it's Awaksil people. And he says, they just want our fish. They didn't damage anything. They put their little one through the same hole we went down in order to tie it from the inside. And he threw the fish up through the hole, and they gathered it up and took it away. So everyone thought, well, they must like our fish. And what can we do? How can we do this? And they all thought about it. And the oldest man said, we'll try to talk with them. He said, because we need this winter supply. This is our food in the winter. He said, we'll make them understand. And he said, so what we're going to do tonight, he says, some of you that are the strongest in our group here, and they kind of always knew who was the fastest and the strongest just by the contests and things that they did in daily life and fun. And so they picked their strongest fellas and said, okay, you folks are going to stay in the smokehouse tonight. And the smoke because it's Awaksil people, they can smell. They're like, they're kind of like animals, even though they're like people as well. Mm-hmm. And they can scent a person just like that. And they don't like to mingle. They try to stay away from people, although occasionally they are seen. He said, you'll be in the smokehouse, so there won't be much scent on you. You'll be in the smoke. And you just have to stay there. And when they put the little one through, he said, you're going to hold on to him or tie him. And he's smaller, so several of you can handle him, they thought. And so that was the decision. And then the old man was going to come and talk to the rest of the Sasquatch group. They didn't know, will this work well, but this is what they decided to try. So they got the strongest ones, and they went in, they tied the door from the inside, and they just stayed in the smokehouse kind of apart so that they could come in on him when the little one came through. And so they had a watchman, and the old man stayed up as well. And then when the Sasquatch people came, they didn't suspect. And they put the young one up. Okay, you're going to get the dried, the salmon that's hanging, you're going to throw it out to us. And when he went down, the stronger men came and kind of went around him and grabbed onto him and had some rope or something to restrain him. And he started kind of squealing or making a noise so that Sasquatch people knew something happened to him. And they kind of were worried and communicated however they did. And before it got too intense, the old man came out and he talked to them in a real calm way, and he just talked simply as he could and said, I know you folks have been taking our dried fish, and we need the dried fish. We use it in the winter. And he said, I know you like what we have here, so they're not going to do anything to your little fella in there, but we needed to make you know that we need this in the winter, and it's dried so that we can use it in the winter, re-soak it, and have meat in the winter. So we can show you how to do this, or we can give you some, but please don't steal from us. Don't take our fish. We need this. And kind of the way he talked was in a way that they understood his communication. And he said, so we'll let your young one go. And the guys opened the door and he came out, and they were, happy. They grabbed onto him because it scared that young one. And they didn't get mad, and they realized what was happening, and they turned and they left. And so that night, it seems like they left some out for them, some of the dried fish, and not too much because they were taking, more than, the people worried about how their winter supply, right? Yeah, and so after that, they didn't have any more trouble with the Sasquatch just taking freely some of their things, and they left some dried fish out for them.
In the early 2000 period, I had a floating native gift store in my home for my young child and my common-law wife at the time over in Village Island, catering to the tourists. And I was stirring soup on the stove, and two kayakers walked into the float house, and the woman goes, "What throws rocks out here, bears or squirrels?" And it got my attention, so I asked her, "What are you talking about?" And she goes, "Oh, we're camped over on Turner Island at this peninsula." I said, "Yeah, I know the place." And she goes, "We're sitting in a little structure." I said, "Yeah, there's like a lean-to frame on the beach, on the White Shell Beach." And she goes, "We were watching the stars sparkle and reflect on the calm water. And all of a sudden we could hear little pebbles, rocks being thrown from the trees behind us and splashing. Ba-dum, ba-dum." And she goes, "We were wondering what it was." And I said, "Well, nothing throws rocks out here except for humans and Fusch, the wild man of the woods, the male Sasquatch. And it's one of their traits. It's a primate characteristic that Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall established back in the 60s with primates. that when threatened or curious, they'll throw rocks. And if they're really threatened, they'll shake foliage or they'll push over dead foliage. And it's documented with chimpanzees, mountain gorillas, orangutans, monkeys, that they do these primate characteristics and acts when they feel threatened. And of course, if you correlate that to Sasquatch Bigfoot sightings, it's rampant. It's across the board. So what is Bigfoot? It's nothing more than North America's undiscovered great ape, but it's also found in Europe, Asia, even down in the South Pacific, Australia, they call it Yowie, and so forth. But out here, we call it Bakwus and Junacha. And when I told that lady about what I thought it was, she got scared. And I said, look, ma'am, I said, I'm a watchman. I'll go grab your tent with your husband, put it in the boat, and we'll bring you over to our village island. You can camp on the dock. And she said, oh, thank you. I want to do that. But when we came here, of course, I went and looked behind the campsite here, and I found a tree snap. It was about that high where something had grabbed a small spruce tree, busted it, and twisted it. Well, a human can't do that. And it wasn't snow damage. It was fresh. It had been done within a few hours. So that's another primate characteristic, especially of the North American Bigfoot, that they do tree stabs. They also do like primitive lean-to shelters and nests. So if you do come across something like that, do I believe in that creature? Of course I do. It's like a white blackberry. You spend enough time out here, you're gonna see it. I have heard them. I have seen them in the spotlight of my seine boat, not a quarter mile away from here in native Anchorage in 1994. It's well documented in Dr. John Bindernagel's book, North America's Undiscovered Great Ape, the Sasquatch, about my encounter with 3 of my crew men on board, and we put a spotlight on, and there 100 yards in front of us, this big, huge human, boom, dropped on its knee, and then the female dropped on its knee and bent like that. And for 20 minutes with my spotlight, we watched these 2 creatures, but I could see reflection of eye, 2 eyes, 1 eye, like something was breathing with its arm in front of it. And when we bring the dance of the Bakwus, the wild man of woods, to life in our big ceremonies of potlatch and other events, you'll have a costume dancer with a fur-covered costume, a mask that looks like this ape, and when you dance it, you're down low like that. And that's what the Bakwus is said to be like when you see it. It's always hiding behind its hair-covered arm. And at times you can hear them out here. What you're listening for is they chirp when they communicate back and forth. And when they holler, they're whoop, 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 when they call back and forth from one to another. And if you don't believe in it, come stay out here in October into November when the clams get good. And I guarantee you're going to believe in something that doesn't just snap, crack, pop in the bush at night. They may even come down and shake some foliage for you if they feel threatened. They may take a stick and bang it against a tree. Bang, 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 bang. And us Aboriginals, when we're taught hunting skills, as I taught my son and others, when you hear that banging of a tree, you stop, turn around, and go back where you came from. That's the Bakwus telling you, my family's here, I don't want you coming further. What happens if you go further? Well, just go on the internet and look about missing people who went camping and kayaking. There's always 1 or 2 that didn't break their legs or get hypothermia and die or have a heart attack. There's always that small percentage of people that probably didn't heed the warning of the Bakwus and they went further in. And of course, when you're 700 pounds to 1,000 pounds and you're a bipedal animal with arms about that thick, well, personally, I wouldn't want to piss them off.
We rehearse him as the Yeti. We rehearse the Yetis like the Bigfoot type of creatures. Yeti, yes, like kind of like the hairy holy man is how we refer to them. Way back in the 1800s, 1860s, when Navajos were being rounded up to be taken to Fort Sumner, the Navajos in my community, with Salvatore, Tisans, along the eastern foothills of the Carrizo Mountains, they gathered up and they decided to give themselves up to the U.S. Cavalry. And some had young kids, young babies who were mentally handicapped, who were like physically handicapped. And they didn't want to take those kids out on that long walk because they didn't trust the soldiers. The soldiers are going to kill them right off the bat because they were a burden to them. They would kill all these handicapped children from the beginning. So in order to give them a chance to survive, they took them up to the top of the mountain there in the Colvilles Mountains. And after 4 years, they came back. So the men of the eastern foothills, they decided to go check on the kids to see if they were still alive up in the mountains. When they approached the area where they left them, they saw smoke coming out of the forest. And they were wondering where that smoke was coming from. Then when they got there, they found a crude shelter that was built for them, or they might have built themselves. They were all happy, healthy, and sitting around. And so when they met the adults at first, they were afraid, and after a while they finally got close enough to where they can retrieve them. And after that happened, they were asking the younger kids how they survived, how they went through this ordeal. And so the ones that could recall, they start talking about how they were crying for 4 days and nights. Then after 4 days and nights, there's these creatures that came up. They're big old, tall, hairy men. They're the ones that built the shelter for them, built the fire for them, and kept them, provided them with food, and helped them survive. So we believe that's probably, they're probably talking about Bigfoots that were there at the time, back in the early or the late 1800s. There are a lot of stories of them, especially in modern day times, along the San Juan River corridor about 15 miles south of here. Every year there's like numerous people reporting of sightings, hearing them like at night. They'll come in and steal watermelons, steal like other fruits from their fields. They'll take like animals like sheep, steal sheep and carry them off, and they probably consume them somewhere down by the river. And then there's all the way up in the Chusca Mountains, in the montane settings. There are also numerous stories of sightings, numerous stories of people being somewhat attacked by Bigfoot, like in the southern part of the Chusca Mountain range. For me, I was a believer, but at the same time, I was a skeptic. It wasn't until 3 years ago until I had my own experience. And it's total pitch darkness around about 12 midnight. I had lunch. I sat on the big old slab of rock. Something really bad and smelly came up behind me, and it threw a handful of pebbles at me, gravel and pebbles, and some of it hit me from behind. And it was probably within 20 feet behind me. I knew there was something back there, but I didn't lose my composure. I kept my composure. I told my colleagues, one of my field assistants and one of my students, I said, hey, let's gather our stuff. Let's move up canyon another quarter mile and give this guy some room behind me. And by acknowledging him that way, I think that's when it kind of surprised whoever was back behind me, because normally, I think what they normally expect is to have somebody frightened, somebody scared, and then that's when they start playing games on you. They start messing with your mind. So when I didn't allow them to do that, I think they allowed us to walk away. And it followed us for a while, then it just left us alone. It probably just kept an eye on us from a distance after that. So after that, I kind of started believing in a lot of people's tales, and because I myself experienced it for myself, and I kind of became an advocate and a believer through experience that Bigfoot myself.
Pawan, Telsqueak, Talitsuqua, Kwantlen, Casta, Scotia. My name is Christopher Alexander Thomas, and I come to you by way of Kwantlen, as well as Scotia First Nation. Kwantlen is located downriver from here in the Fort Langley area, and Scotia is located in the Sardis area, in the Chilliwack, Chilliwack area. And the story that I'm going to be sharing with you here today was passed down through the generations before me. It's an honor for me to be here because we're here on behalf of Rocky LaRock. You can see one of his masks here, his Sasquatch masks. And today I'm going to be sharing the story of the hunter and the Sasquatch. This story was brought to us by way of Dolly Felix, who is auntie to Rocky LaRock. And it's an honor for me to echo the words of our ancestors by way of Dolly Felix at this time. So with that, I put my hands up to the ones who made this possible for this day, and I put my hands up to the ones who made this story possible to be able to share out in the communities and for the people in general. Haitska. There was once a young Indian man who lived with his grandparents near the Morris Valley. In the olden days, it was common for the young people to go and live with their grandparents. The young man got up each and every day along with his grandparents at the break of daylight. Since there was no road yet, he would take the path up the little mountain and go hunting. Up he would go until he came up to a space which was like a little prairie alongside the mountain. Right in the middle of the open space, there was a large boulder. And on this particular day, the young Indian boy stopped ashore. He looked up at the rock, too frightened to move. Sitting on the boulder, one hand on his chin, was sitting there a Sasquatch. The young man felt that he was too close to run away, for the Sasquatch would surely chase after him. He looked at his gun and he shook his head, remembering the many warnings he had against shooting the Sasquatch. The only thing he could do, walk straight ahead and past the rock where the Sasquatch was sitting. As he did this, he nodded his head politely at the Sasquatch as if he was saying hello to the Sasquatch. He meant to show the Sasquatch that he had no intent to do any harm to it. Only when the young man reached the bushes did he feel safe enough to turn around and look at the Sasquatch. Sure enough, the Sasquatch was still sitting there in the same position. Although he wanted to run, the young man was still afraid of the Sasquatch, that he would get chased by him. So he walked at a normal pace along the path. He hadn't gone very far when he saw a deer in front of him on the path. The young man shot it and began to drag it home. He had gone only a short distance with his heavy load when another deer appeared on the path. This he also shot, but knowing he was not able to drag both deer, he left both deer on the path and went back to the village to look for help. When he arrived home, he told his grandparents what had happened to him. "The Sasquatch had pity on you," said the grandfather. "This is the Indians' belief. Because you saw a Sasquatch, but did not mean any harm to it, you were given your first deer." Young men from the village went to the hunter's spot where he left the deers, and they came to help him drag those deers back to the village. The young man knew that because it was his first kill, he could not keep one bit of it. It is the rules and the regulations of our people. Go hunting and you kill something for the first time, that it's important that you give it away to the fellow village members, and so that you'd have better fortunes come when it's time to go out and provide for the people again. This was time for celebration. Because it was the hunter's first kill, the village and the elders and the CMs came together and they gathered the people and they celebrated. At this time, it was only the elders that came forward and ate the deer meat. And after that, they sat down and they left words of wisdom with the hunter as well as the young people. after they did the celebration and after the young hunter distributed his meat to all the community members and the village members, the community and the village members came together and they made a collection. And what the collection was for, it was so that the young hunter could then purchase more shells or bullets so that he could go out and do more hunting and provide for his people. So the young warrior ending up being an amazing provider and a hunter for his people. And it was said that every time he went out hunting, he never came back empty-handed. So that's the story of the hunter and the Sasquatch. He had never ever seen a Sasquatch before. And to us, if oneself was to see a Sasquatch, it was meant to be, and it was called one of the greatest gifts to our people. And the reason for that is because when we were growing up, we were taught that the Sasquatch, if you seen him, he or she wanted you to see him. The elders always taught us they're the closest to the other side, meaning they were closest to the ancestors. So because they had that gift of being so close to the ancestors, they also believed that they had the gift of being a shapeshifter. So it was meant for the young warrior, the young hunter, to be able to see the Sasquatch. The Sasquatch wanted him to see him, but he was also there for a test as well. And that test was this young hunter going to shoot him with his gun? And if he was, then the elders always told us that was a failed test. So, but because the young hunter, he used his common sense and he remembered what he was taught while he was growing up, which is really good. He was granted the gift of the four-legged, the deer. The deer naturally came to him because the Sasquatch, the Sasquatch has connection to each and every one of the brothers and sisters in the grandfather and the mother forests, the mother nature. Now his connection is very sacred. We believe that all the animals have connections to one another, and occasionally on times like this, like the hunter, is one of the times where they're able to connect with humans as human beings. And it's not every day that connection will be made. And there was a time when our people were able to talk to the animals and the fish and the flyers. And but through time, we lost those gifts. But our elders always taught us never give up. That's why they tell us to exercise and practice the language as much as we can, because that's what connects us to our ancestors. So with that, I want to say Kusai Haitska for having me here to share a little bit about the significance of our brothers, the Sasquatch, and our sisters, and what they mean to us and how secret they are to us as Wilmuk people. Haitska Kusai, Isiam, and have a good night.
Thank you again for listening to this series.
We love you guys. We'll catch you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, bye, bye.
At 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, multiple unidentified objects were confirmed to have entered Earth's atmosphere. It is speculated that these objects are of extraterrestrial origin. The broadcast will quiet at this time for your safety. Continue to carry out the following instructions.
Radio Grave Podcast is hosted by Amber Byland and Dominique Makasuya. Music courtesy of AOA Music, Carl Casey at Whitebat Audio, and intro music by Simon Big Byland. Audio mixing and editing by Amber Byland. Logo and original art by Dominique Makasuya. Special thanks to Selma and Obi Henneke, Austin Smith, and all our supporters on Patreon. All other media and sound clips used are protected under fair use and are for the purpose of criticism, commentary, news reporting, education, and research. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.